listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-George and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. This is the second instalment of our two-part conversation with Adam Hearne, CEO and co-founder of CarbonChain. If you haven't listened to part one yet, please do go back into our catalogue to listen to it first. Welcome back, Adam.
G'day, Barbara. Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Glad to have you. So in part one, we talked about how CarbonChain helps companies manage their supply chain emissions, what sectors you're focused on, and we started discussing the evolving regulatory landscape. In part two, I'd love to talk to you more in depth about policy and hear more advice that you have for companies on managing their value chains. So on CarbonChain's website, you have a lot of free resources available on topics such as carbon accounting, Scope 3 emissions, and on policy areas such as the Omnibus Simplification Package, the US Foreign Pollution Fee Act, the ISSB standards, to name a few. So could you explain in a bit more detail which particular global standards and frameworks your software aligns with?
Sure can, Barbara, and appreciate that it's a bit of an alphabet soup out there.
Indeed.
There's so many standards to keep up with, and we find a lot of our customers almost overwhelmed by the different regulations, but also the updates to regulations and then different standards for different industries. So our advice is, thanks for mentioning some of those big standards and frameworks. Our advice is to go back to the fundamental standards that we align to globally, and that is the GHG Protocol Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard and the GHG Protocol Product Lifecycle Accounting and Reporting Standard. With CarbonChain is validated against those as well, and we are independently audited accordingly, and we keep that refreshed and hold ourselves to account, so to speak, to ensure that we give that high quality of methodology to our customers. But the value in aligning to those standards is that they are the core of a lot of other frameworks that are out there today. So a lot of the other acronyms you've mentioned are derived works of or aligned to those fundamentals. And being global standards, the world needed these global roots to align to, and so we've been able to do that. And then by the time we release this podcast, there'll be some tweaks to some of the day-to-day regulations in different countries. So watch the space, but know that if you're aligned to those GHG protocol standards, you're future-proofing your reporting efforts.
Great, thank you. So as a company, how do you keep track of all these different policy areas and the changes that come with them? And how do you adapt your products accordingly?
We have a few ways to stay informed in the market. In a lot of cases, we're privileged to be invited in by these standards bodies to give advanced comment on draft works or being part of working groups that are informing standards and frameworks. Additionally, we speak to a lot of customers who are participating at very senior levels with the way regulation is defined. And then we're also helping companies implement their own compliance frameworks. And we can see firsthand that if companies are unable to meet a lot of regulation, it's not going to be sustainable in many senses of the word sustainable. And therefore, when you see cases like a rollback from the EU, due to 180,000 businesses having a burdensome process, we can see that ahead of time, and that it's just a ridiculous amount of work for companies that are very small and don't have the staff on hand to actually specialize in these regulations. And so you can anticipate a common sense approach in a few scenarios, but we stay vigilant on behalf of our customers and always assume that we need to report to the highest common denominator of quality and granularity. But there are a few levers that we can pull here at CarbonChain, knowing that we can specialize in this area, whereas other businesses have to focus on their core business first and then compliance as they can.
And I suppose because you are mostly focused on carbon accounting, so many of these policies focus on many other areas. So for example, the CSRD and the ESRS framework that you have to follow on, you're focusing on E, S, and G. Of course, carbon aligns with other areas, but I'm guessing being really focused on carbon, it's in the name, helps have that speciality in that specific area.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of urgency around carbon emissions in our view, and we do acknowledge that in the ESG that the S&G exists, and we do obsess about the E almost to a point where we think it stands for emissions over environment, but we know that there is a lot to contend with. But we find that our customers can be freed up a lot by making sure their emissions are managed and handled by the CarbonChain platform, and in some cases we can guide them on dealing with their overall submissions. But for the short term, we see that the focus is paying off to help companies with the carbon side.
We touched upon this briefly in part one, but I wanted to ask, can companies in any geographical location reach out to you for support, i.e. you have your eyes on policy worldwide, obviously not just in the UK where you're based or in the US where you have an office. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. We have our services translated into certain languages where we see a large demand. And also, we have to be agnostic to country because a lot of our customers are global traders, global commodities traders, or they work in supply chains that span many regions. So we have to be able to converse with a lot of different regulations out there. In some ways, CarbonChain is like the Rosetta Stone of carbon accounting, one platform to help you manage all the regulations and frameworks out there.
Lovely framing. Thank you. Um, Again, we touched upon this briefly in part one, but you have a whole section on your website dedicated to the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Can you explain a bit more about this regulation and more specifically how it's going to impact businesses?
This is quite a huge change for trade, for global trade. So imagine this year, 2025, we are doing some carbon accounting in your day-to-day life as a business. Next year, you could actually be fined for non-compliance or non-conformance to CBAM standards, which is incredible for a compliance manager to think of, or even a risk manager in a company. There are a lot of hidden hotspots where you can incur um, a carbon price, an unexpected carbon price, due to your goods being sourced from high carbon locations, or also fines for not knowing the origin of your supply chains. That's what the carbon border is effectively implementing for Europe. It's a mechanism to help mitigate against carbon leakage as a global concept. But importantly, for those who do a lot of trade with Europe, they need to be aware of the carbon border that now exists and the real financial implications for not complying to their needs of that carbon border.
And when you mentioned the real financial implications, so I'm guessing, it's operating on the focus that really non-compliance will have consequences. You believe that kind of the mechanisms are in place to fine companies then that are not adhering to it.
Yes, exactly. And it's in stages depending on how much of a depending on how severe the non-compliance is. It can be anything from just still declaring your paperwork but not knowing the intensity of your carbon emissions, and therefore you get given defaults from the EU, and those default values for carbon intensity are often higher than you would expect, as a punitive measure to incentivize companies to find out what the real emissions are, because that's what the EU wants to avoid carbon leakage. We need to make sure that carbon can't pass through borders without being tracked to its provenance, to the origin of the emissions, and then ultimately you can cease to be able to trade with Europe if you are not complying. They can actually stop your goods coming in. So we have some customers that are trying to make sure they've managed this just so that their supply chains can keep flowing uninterrupted. We have some customers that work in critical sectors where anything getting stuck in a port for a day or a week could severely impact their ability to generate revenue. And so they just want to have friction-free trading, and they use CarbonChain to ensure that.
Okay, thank you for explaining. We mentioned it briefly. The Omnibus Simplification Package. You have a section on it on your website, and you outline why you feel companies should still prioritize precise carbon accounting. So I'll quote from your website. You say, at CarbonChain, we know that quality Scope 3 carbon accounting remains essential, regardless of shifting policies. Businesses must continue to understand their emissions, manage risks, and prepare for long-term sustainability compliance, not just mean minimum requirements. Could you expand a bit more on this quote? Obviously, we talked a bit about helping companies secure, long-term, low-carbon, for example, power contracts. But yeah, could you expand on your general approach to why you feel that carbon accounting is still going to be so essential?
Yeah, we spoke earlier on companies getting interest rate discounts from their banks
Hmm.
simply for measuring emissions, and also some companies securing green premiums or so called green premiums for lower carbon products that they sell. And to expand on that comment further, we've noticed that we've been running CarbonChain for 5 years now, and in the early years, there were customers that just wanted to tick a box for compliance purposes.
Hmm.
Have you got the piece of paper? Have you checked your emissions? If yes, tick, you can carry on.
Hmm.
And what we're noticing now is that just ticking a box is no longer good enough. The underlying emissions, once they're known, can actually have a bigger, broader spectrum of risks and financial risks than people first realize. And so, getting into that next level of detail beyond compliance, we like to describe it as here,
Hmm.
getting beyond compliance is incredibly useful to know what your risks are, but also to know what your suppliers' risks might be when they may not be aware themselves. People often buy from overseas countries that don't have the same standards in place that they do, and they will be subject to global standards quite soon if they aren't aware of where their own origins are governed by.
Thank you. I always like to ask towards the end for advice from my guests. So, what advice would you give to companies who are perhaps less sure how to or even why manage their value chain emissions? And specifically, I think the example that you gave on suppliers is very key. What would you say to companies who've never really engaged their suppliers on this topic and don't know where to begin?
Asking is the most powerful first step. If you're not sure of what the emissions are from your suppliers, ask. And this gives you two incredibly good insights. One is the emissions themselves, so you can sometimes get freebies here. And two is if your suppliers don't know themselves,
Hmm.
that might be because there are bigger risks behind the scenes than you realize. And not knowing is no longer an excuse that can be used. So, first step, ask. And second step, get support from people who know, experts like CarbonChain, who have done this thousands and thousands of times across thousands of suppliers, hundreds of thousands of suppliers, so that we can help you save time and help you focus on your core business at hand. It's still very imperative for companies to be aware of what their supply chain carbon emissions are.
And do you work with companies or do you advise companies on how to begin that relationship? I ask because I've worked with companies, who are working on their CSRD aligned sustainability reports, and that they now have a whole strategy and might even be kind of helping their suppliers measure their carbon emissions. Do you go into that level of detail, or kind of just on a more strategy level?
So this is a good use case for CarbonChain.
Mm.
If there are a lot of options out there, but if you use CarbonChain, in a lot of cases, if your supplier doesn't know, we can help give an estimate to your supplier for what they would come up with themselves in lieu of them having advanced tools or dedicated resources. We find that this is a really good gesture from for our customers, because at the end of the day, supply chains also indicate relationships, and there is
Mhm.
a lot of relationship equity and commercial terms that companies want to maintain. And so CarbonChain really tries to focus on the lowest friction way to help those customers engage their supply chains. And sometimes giving the answer to their suppliers
Mhm.
is the best way for them to reach out and create that dialogue that's needed for the longer term business.
Perfect. That's good to know. Um, a question, kind of changing topic, maybe slightly. Obviously, what's come through both of these episodes, and I think you mentioned it in both parts, is that trade is now kind of unequivocally global. Um, Again, with the way that the world is shifting, do you feel that that's going to remain the same? That the world is going to be kind of as globalized, and that's why it's as important or more important than ever to keep an eye on those relationships, to check how things are being done across borders? Or do you think that maybe things are going to be a bit more insular? Yeah, I'd love to get your personal thoughts on that.
It is a dynamic time as we're recording this, and we've got
Mm.
some incredible tariff movements out there in the market.
Mhm.
We also see some incredible rollback of tariff statements, and
Yes.
the taco trade is a strategy that's being employed.
Mhm.
And the thought of changing global supply chain configurations is something that's easier said than done. And I can speak from 3 years of experience at Amazon, knowing how deep the supply chain configuration actually is and how hard it can be to change, even at the scale of Amazon. And what we've seen with our customers across hundreds of billions of dollars worth of global trade is that if there are economically viable supply chains running, it's very hard to reconfigure them. The US can't really just go to domestic production in a couple of months. There are price issues, there are product quality issues. It's really hard to overcome. And what we've seen is time and time again that supply chains do revert back to the average. And so if over the last 20 years, if supply chains have been configured in a certain way, lots of stuff coming out of China basically is the main configuration. And China is the manufacturing engine of the world. Things will continue to trend like that. Most of the world's products that are needed over the next decade are already monopolized by China. They have most of the world's solar panels, EVs, wind turbine parts, everything the rest of the world needs to actually hit its net zero targets are controlled by China. And that's a throttling mechanism. And so there will be trade coming out of these areas, whether the world likes to think so or not, like whether they think it'll change that much. I don't think it will. And we have to be ready for knowing that we're trading from very distant geographies for a long time to come, and knowing your supply chain emissions are a good way to get visibility on that risk area.
Super interesting. Thank you for that answer. Great. Well, then my final question to you, again, we did touch upon this a little bit, but I think there's maybe more to say. If things really shift dramatically, if carbon regulation becomes less stringent worldwide, are you optimistic that companies will want to go beyond compliance, that they'll still be motivated to manage their value chain emissions? If so, why? And if not, how can stakeholders like you and I convince them that it should still be a priority?
So assuming carbon regulation becomes less stringent, is that the scenario?
Yes, indeed. Things change dramatically, and suddenly, things that were ironclad, are not a given anymore.
If it becomes less stringent worldwide, I'd like to think it's because CarbonChain has done such a good job of automating and centralizing this information in an easily and accessible location that governments and different trade bodies worldwide can use that almost like a back office function and just automate that. So that would be a sign of success as far as CarbonChain.
That would be a dream, I imagine.
Yeah.
Got carbon regulation or not. Yeah.
And then that effort that used to go on carbon reporting for the sake of reporting, we would love to see that change to decarbonisation. So once you get the reports done, now you can switch to thinking about how do you actually decarbonise. And there is a lot of supply out there that is lower carbon, and there's a lot more renewable energy coming online, where the capital projects that have gone into those renewable power assets, those new investments, they're looking for a certain yield or return on that big capital investment, and that's where we're seeing a lot more price competitiveness come out of lower carbon assets. So by continuing to think about lower carbon beyond, well after the compliance box has been ticked and after it's a mainstream business activity, is actual cost advantage. And again, the carbon borders out there will actually increase their ambition. And so although carbon compliance might be easier, staying ahead of the carbon taxes and the ambition of decarbonisation policies is an ongoing pursuit for companies. So they need to keep tracking the emissions and make sure they are getting lower and lower and lower, and ultimately to net zero. And so that's our biggest threat as a business. If the world does reach net zero in relatively short order over the next few years, we are probably out of a job over here, but we're willing to take that risk as a business just because we're getting to our original mission, which was to help accelerate decarbonising the economy.
And I'm sure there's different areas to diversify into. But no, but that's very interesting because I think you've discussed, I think, carbon mostly in financial terms, right? I think as someone who works in sustainability on so many different areas, I personally always find that tension between talking about the financial risks, the money aspect of it, and the kind of sustainability story. But I think you're being very straightforward in that, in every possible sense, whether there's compliance or non-compliance, whatever your competitor's doing, it makes financial sense to decarbonize, right?
Yeah, as a business owner myself, but also thinking through that commercial lens and from personal experience, we've noticed that incentives are just incredible. And a personal anecdote to share that I remember hearing about was when they introduced a levy in the UK for plastic bags. And apparently within the first month of this 5p levy being introduced for a plastic bag, in the first month, they're able to reduce plastic waste more so than the last 2 decades of handing out reusable bags or material bags. And it was just because people are at the till at the moment having to hand over that extra little bit of money to have a plastic bag. And we noticed the same in carbon and thinking about emissions. The universal language is incentives. And if you're focusing on that commercial aspect, that in itself is a sustainable way for us to support our customers and making sure that the transition is a fair transition, as opposed to something that can be seen as ambitious beyond the ability of the companies that work to do it. We have to make sure it's a financially sustainable ambition. And so that's how we can be the most help, just trying to get it back to practical terms and making sure it's a viable endeavor.
Wow, what a great statistic. I think I was living in the UK when that came in, but I didn't realize the impact had been that dramatic. Wow, incredible. Well, thank you very much, Adam, for coming on and joining us today for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.